Good evening. We're in Joshua chapter 5, the book of Joshua chapter 5. Joshua chapter 5. The book of Joshua is about faith. We talked about that last week as we began. It's a book about faith that produces strength and courage. Because as you open up the book of Joshua, one of the things you see immediately is God telling Joshua over and over and over, be strong and courageous. And then the people tell Joshua at the end of chapter 1, be strong and courageous. We'll do whatever you say. We'll do everything you command us to do because the Lord has put you in Moses' place. You're now our leader, so we'll do anything that you tell us to do. So be strong and courageous. It's faith in God that allows you then to move into situations that are threatening, difficulties, hardships, frightening places, and yet to have the strength and the courage to do that, even though you're frightened, even though it may be scary, even though it's not comfortable. You have strength and courage because of your faith in God. So Joshua is trusting in the Lord. And that's really what happens as we begin in chapter 5, and when we get to chapter 6, what we're going to see is they've entered the land, and as they enter the land, the first thing they're going to face is the great walled city of Jericho. And we'll get to that in a little while, and we'll talk about that one as well. I mentioned last week, as you open up chapter 5, in chapter 5, verses 1 through 12, you have the new generation being circumcised. Not going to read all that. I'm not going to really discuss it any further because there's really nothing, I think, that's of any great significance other than the fact that the thing that is necessary is for the people to be dedicated to the Lord. It's a sign of your commitment. It's that time in which a male member of the Israelite nation is dedicated to the Lord. Usually that took place on the 8th day, 8 days old. And so now Joshua circumcises them. Joshua chapter 5, verse 4. And so when everything was finished, that's all the way down in verse 8, the whole nation was finished. They remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. And the Lord said to Joshua, today I've rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. And so the name of this place is called Gilgal to this day, which, there's some discrepancy in exactly what Gilgal means, but the idea is to roll or something like that. And so now you have them celebrating the first Passover. You know what the Passover is, so I'm not going to go back and explain that, but that's done in verses 10 through 12. Now, as you move into the next section, you have the introduction to the commander of the Lord's army, and you have Joshua who's commanded to take off his sandals. Matter of fact, the very last verse in chapter 5, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy, and Joshua did so. One of the things that you're seeing is this preparation and the getting ready of the people to do what God said do, to get the people ready. Now, one of the things that really strikes me in the circumcision of the nation is that during that time, they're going to be vulnerable. They're not going to be up to the task, so to speak. They're going to be down for a while. So there's that moment when there's no trust in themselves. There's no ability to say, hey, if we're attacked or if the enemy comes, we'll fight. It's just not going to happen yet. So that, I think, is a moment when God is teaching them to trust in Him. Make sure you trust in me. Make sure that you do that. Then again, they're reminded of the time when God intervened and delivered the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage when they partake of this Passover meal. The reminder of how God had worked through their ancestors and brought them out of that bondage. And by the way, this is fresh with them, because what's been happening now is that generation that was delivered out of Egyptian bondage has all died in the wilderness. And so now you've got this generation of those who are under 20 years old who have now grown up in the last 40 years. They've been able to grow and be now the generation that's about to enter the promised land. And so they're partaking of this Passover that reminds them of how God took care of His people. So this is a reminder of you can trust in God, you can put your faith in Him. So remember, it's a book about faith. Joshua is a book about the people needing to put their faith in Him. So when you get to this end of chapter 5, or this is the middle part where they're partaking of the Passover, and then you move into this next part where Joshua is near Jericho, and this is when he comes into contact with this commander of the army of the Lord. That's in verses 13 through the end of the chapter. That's through 13 through 15. So that's really where I want to pick up tonight is verses 13 through 15, and this is Joshua encountering this commander of the Lord's army. Let me begin reading in verse 13. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Now, you think Joshua remembered, or you think Moses told Joshua the story about the burning bush? I think somewhere along the line, Moses and Joshua are sitting around a campfire, and Moses says, "You're not going to believe how I came to be the leader of the people of God. You're not going to believe it." And he starts telling him about this burning bush. And in a very deep voice, Moses says to Joshua, and the voice said, "Remove your shoes, because the land, I think he probably told him that story. I would. That's pretty fascinating. Now, Moses had a whole book full of things he needed to tell Joshua, but I'm sure he told him that. Now, isn't this is the same kind of story. It's a story of Joshua coming into contact with the Holy One. And the same statement is made, much like it was with Moses. "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Now, what I find interesting is there is nothing that follows that except the taking of Jericho. Do you find that there's no explanation after that? There's no, okay, what happened next? It wasn't like with Moses, where Moses then is going to then go to Egypt and lead the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage. But what happens next is just as fascinating, because what happens next is that Joshua is going to lead the children of Israel in conquest of the great walled city of Jericho, because it opens up chapter 6, verse 1. Note, "Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and none went in. And the Lord said to Joshua. So, if you know an enemy is coming, and your protection is your walls and your gates, what are you going to do when you know the enemy's coming? You're going to close your gates. So the gates are shut, and they're not even going to crack them a little bit and let you go out and hunt some deer. They're not going to do that. They're not going to crack those gates even just a little bit so you can look out. No, they're not going to. It's shut up tight. And the Lord says, I have given Jericho into your hand. So what I'm connecting then is what happens at the end of chapter 5 with what happens in chapter 6, because when Joshua has this encounter with the commander of the Lord's army, and Joshua falls down to worship, and the next thing that you see, or he says, what will you have me to do? What does the Lord's servant, let me just look at it and read it. What does my Lord say to his servant? What message do you have for me? Was what Joshua asks. Then the commander of the Lord said to Joshua, commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take off your sandals because your feet are on holy ground. And then the next thing that happens is the Lord says, I have given to you the great walled city of Jericho. Now, let me hear your comments and observations. Hopefully this sparks some things in you that come to light from the verses 13 and following of chapter 5 and the beginning of chapter 6.
Barry, when he said, I'm the commander of the Lord's army, Joshua fell down to worship. He didn't stop him like an angel would.
Right.
So, and then he told him to remove his feet, just like when Moses was in the presence of God at the burning bush. So, commander of the Lord's army, which of the Trinity was that?
I think most of the commentators are convinced, and I don't know that commentators aren't inspired, but most are convinced that this would be Jesus.
Okay, that's what I thought. They're right.
Yeah, they're right. Tommy says they agree with him, so they're right. Yeah, I think the commander of the Lord's army is Christ. We don't usually see the Holy Spirit in that kind of context in the Old Testament.
Holy ground.
Holy ground, that's exactly right. So it had to be one of them, and that's Ryan's question. I think it was Jesus. All right, any other observations? So you see the connections that are going on. The Passover, take off your shoes because you're on holy ground. All of this reflecting back to Moses and how God dealt with Moses. And this is not the first time this has happened in the book of Joshua. It's just so obvious here at the end of middle and the end of chapter 5. And so that brings us then to chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. And this would be the first part of the faith walk that the Israelites go on in order to bring down the city of Jericho, this great walled city of Jericho. Now, understand, this is not the first church I worked at was in Harrodsburg, Kentucky. We were there to plant a church. There wasn't a church in the whole city of Mercer County. There was 30,000 people in the county and no church in that county. And one of the places that you took everybody sightseeing when they came to visit was the fort that was the original Harrodsburg Fort. James Harrod and Daniel Boone came over the Appalachian Mountains and they settled there in Harrodsburg, and they called it Harrodsburg after James Harrod, who was with Daniel Boone. And so the first thing they did was built a fort. And you know what one of those early American forts looked like, don't you? They were logs from that big to bigger, and they were chopped to be pointed at the top. I guess they thought that would stop anybody from crawling over. But we're not talking about that kind of wall. We're not talking about the kind of wall that you could set on fire and burn, or that you could push over, or you could chop through. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, in some cases, what it seems like is maybe 40 feet tall, 40 feet thick, with houses built on top of it, as we know from Rahab. So those kind of walls, you don't push them over. As a matter of fact, some of the marauding nations would haul in dirt because they knew they couldn't knock the walls down. They would haul in dirt and build a ramp so they could just walk right over the walls. Now, that's pretty ingenious, but I'm sitting here watching you build that ramp, so I'm coming up with all kind of ingenious ideas about hot boiling oil and all kind of great things that I could do to you while you're trying to do that. But this was a great walled city. It wasn't the kind of wall that was probably going to be temporary. It was something that was built in order to protect the city, and it did that. Except when it was the Lord's army. And so we're going to see what happens. We'll read 1 through 14 just to begin. And note the beginning of this, Jericho was shut up. So what has to happen now for them to be able to defeat or to knock down the city of Jericho? They have to have faith, because being the best army in the world is not going to bring it down. What's going to bring it down is for them to have faith. Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out, none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once. Thus shall you do for 6 days." Now, the march of faith is going to be once a day for 6 days. That's verse 3. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priest shall blow the trumpet. So 6 days, 1 time a day, 7th day, 7 times. And then all of these folks that are assisting in this walk, specifically we're talking about the priest. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the ark. On the 7th day you'll march around the city 7 times, and the priest shall blow the trumpet. Verse 5, and when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall flat. That's God's plan. That's why I call it a walk of faith. Because he says, you march around it once a day for 6 days, 7 times on the 7th day. The priests are going to blow the trumpets, and everybody's going to shout. All the people will shout with a great shout, and then the wall of the city will fall down, and the people shall go up, everyone straight before him. So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." And he said to the people, "Go forward, march around the city, let the armed men pass on before the ark of the Lord." And just as Joshua had commanded the people, the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward, blowing the trumpets with the ark of the covenant of the Lord following them. The armed men were walking before the priests who were blowing the trumpets, and the rear guard was walking after the ark while the trumpets blew continually. But Joshua commanded the people, "You shall not shout or make your voice heard, neither shall any word go out of your mouth until the day I tell you to shout, then you shall shout." So he caused the ark of the Lord to circle the city, going about it once, and they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord walked on, and they blew the trumpets continually, and the armed men were walking before them, and the rear guard was walking after the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets blew continually. And the second day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. So they did for 6 days. Now, this the perfect application here is if they had done something different, would the walls have fallen? Well, we often go to illustrations like this in the Old Testament. The Lord said, do it this way, and if you change it up, then there's no faith in the Lord. There's faith in your ability or something like that, or whatever might have motivated you to change it. If they decided they were going to sleep in on day 3, we're not going to walk around it on day 3. Or if they decided we're going to shout when Joshua said, don't you even speak a word. Don't you shout till I tell you to. I think that's just an obvious application that we can make here. But that section ends, verse 14. They did this every day for 6 days. They did as the Lord had said. Though you only have the actual words that describe what happened on day 1 and 2, he says, and they did this for 6 days. Now notice verse 15 and following. That's really, it goes all the way through 27, so I guess time won't allow us to do all of that. But let's pick up in verse 15, and we'll read through 21 anyway. On the 7th day, they rose early at the dawn of the day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times, and at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And the city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But you keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest when you have devoted them, you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction, and bring trouble upon it. But all silver and gold and every vessel of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord." So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. Then they devoted all of the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, donkeys, with the edge of the sword. But to the 2 men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring out from there the woman and all who belong to her, as you swore to her." And of course they did that, and that's they have the city. The idea of dedicating everything within that city to the sword, everything that wasn't dedicated to the Lord was killed. So that's how the city of Jericho was taken. It was a walk of faith. 1 time each day for 6 days, 7 times on the 7th day. The trumpets blew, the people shouted, and it says the walls fell flat. And they went in and took the city. Now, note that there was a very strong emphasis by Joshua not to take anything. Everything's dedicated to the Lord. Gold, silver, anything of value, anything. Don't you dare think about taking something for yourself. You know what's about to happen, don't you? I mean, you've read this before. Chapter 7, Israel is going to be defeated at Ai because of this man named Achan. Took some of the things devoted to the Lord. So, but we're not there yet, but just wanted to emphasize that what you have in this chapter, in the middle of this, actually right before the end of chapter 6, you have this really strong instruction from Joshua to the people for them not to take anything that is dedicated. So you have the destruction of the city, you have the obedience of the people, the walk of faith, the obedience of the people, the falling of the walls of Jericho, the salvation that came to Rahab and her family, That was guaranteed, and Joshua says, you two spies, you go take care of that. You promised that she'd be safe. You go to her house. You make sure everybody gets out safe. He gave them that duty. Then he emphasizes over and over that there is not to be anything taken by the people. It's dedicated to the Lord. These things have been dedicated to the Lord. So while the city is destroyed, Rahab is saved. Rahab and her family are saved. And by the way, there's a curse placed upon anyone who would rebuild the city of Jericho. And it really ends, note 26 and 27. Joshua laid an oath on them at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds the city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation, and the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. You remember early on, I think it was chapter 2, where Joshua was told by God, "I will give you a name. I will bless you. I will give you," see, how did he put that? I'm not going to turn back there, but remember he said, "You don't have to make a name for yourself. I will lift you up." I think maybe is the way that he puts it. So that's what he does here. The Lord was with Joshua, and Joshua's fame spread as the leader of the Israelite people. Okay, some observations you'd like to make from maybe chapter 6?
House was on the wall, correct? It was actually built on top of the 40-foot wall, right?
It seems so, yes.
Okay. And when they walked around the city, the walls fell. Do you think that her house was saved by God, or do you think that just enough wall fell for them to get in so they could rebuild it and have a wall for their city? Yeah, I mean, I know that may be a question that you don't know. We may have to ask when we get to heaven, but it's kind of interesting.
It is an interesting question. And the hypothetical part of it is what's interesting. I don't know how they protected Rahab's house. I think logically speaking, I would say that section of the wall didn't fall, but it says the wall fell flat. So did they fall and God protected the house? That seems more logical to me. Anybody else want to jump in there and do guesswork?
I just think it was quite an example for the people of Israel to show God's power.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't even have to lift your hands, you just have to walk. You don't have to fight, you don't have to do anything. Those walls are going to come tumbling down. And to this day, they have excavated those walls, some of those walls. And they are as big as what you were saying. Mm-hmm. And they're there. They're there for everybody to see.
And from what I understand, the archaeological digs show that they fell flat, not over. Mm-hmm. Whereas if an earthquake did it, it would fall differently. But it's interesting, very interesting.
Ray, what does it say in 1 Corinthians? God chooses the foolish, something about to prove the wise wrong, mm-hmm. Chooses the weak, something about the strong. So it basically says he does things that way to show that only his power, only he can do that.
Right. Yeah, great observation. Ryan's comment is that the things that God does, and
doesn't make sense.
Ryan refers to a verse in 1 Corinthians, I think, that when we look at it, there's no other explanation. It makes no common sense. There is no law of physics that makes it possible. There are people that will try to explain this away or say it's a myth or something like that. But the reality of it is it happened, and it happened in a way that it could have only been God, and that was Ryan. Okay, good.
wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring nothing to things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God.
Yeah, you could look, that's good, 1 Corinthians 1:26 in beginning is what Ryan was reading there. You can look at almost any of the miracles of Jesus, or you can look at the miracles of Jesus, or you can look at any of the actions of God with the Israelites in the Old Testament, and that's exactly what you're going to see. That these miracles could not have been a result of human ingenuity or smarts or skill or anything like that. They were certainly from God. Using the things of the world that are despised, use a little teenage girl and a little carpenter guy that were from Galilee. Imagine that. To bring your son into the world. All right, great. Any other observations? Chapter 6 moves pretty quickly, so we didn't spend a lot of time there, but you actually have the first part of the book through about verse 14, where it says they did this it ends by saying they did this for all 6 days, and then beginning in 15, it starts with the seventh day, and it concludes in the end of the chapter with the walls falling. You have in between there the instruction from Joshua, and then Joshua is lifted up, made famous by the Lord because of this first victory. But remember, they had already heard about the God that Joshua was serving. Remember Rahab? When the spies came into Rahab, she said, "We've already heard about you. We're afraid already. We know about your God." So that they've already heard about the Lord God, and now they know about Joshua who's serving this God. I don't know where I read this, but I read an article one time, and the title of the article was, "Would you trust God if He asked you to walk in circles?" And it referred to this chapter in Judges. He used this chapter in Judges. Would you trust in God if He asked you to walk in circles? And I thought that was pretty good. And maybe it goes back to exactly what Ryan was saying, that this doesn't make sense. This is foolish. And about day 6, what do you think some of them are saying? You know, I'm not sure if we need to trust God here or not. Is this, you know, how foolish is this that we're going around and around in circles around the city of Jericho? Mm-hmm. Playing the horn. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Where is that great God? Did He leave them and now they're just wandering around like they have no mind left? Yeah. Anyway, I wish I could remember that Devo, but I do remember the title of it, and I'm reminded of it when I come to this part of Joshua. Chapter 7 is going to play right back into what Joshua told the Israelites before they finally shouted and the walls fell, which was, "Don't take anything." Notice chapter 7, verse 1. Somebody read that and read it for us. Chapter 7, verse 1.
But the people of Israel broke faith in regard and devoted things to Achan, the son of Carmel, son of Zabul, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, and took some of the devoted things, and the anger of the Lord burned against the people of Israel. All right,
what does that first phrase say? But the people what? broke faith. English Standard says broke faith. In regard to what? The things that were devoted to God. Yeah, that's exactly what that verse is saying. You were told, don't take any of the plunder, any of the things that will be a result of this victory over the city of Jericho. Don't take anything. It's dedicated to the Lord. But Achan, it calls his lineage out here, it says, took some of the devoted things, and the anger of the Lord burned against the people of Israel, not just against Achan. Why did the anger of the Lord burn against the people and not just Achan? It was just Achan that sinned. Why against all the people?
The Israelites. Glory.
Yeah, that's what it says.
So it says
But the people, yes. Yeah,
It points at Achan, but it says, but the Israelites.
That's exactly how it starts. And mine says, but the people of Israel. Yeah.
It's kind of like, Barry, what I think of is when you're in the army and basic training, and one guy messes up, but the whole platoon's doing push-ups.
Mm-hmm.
Why do they do that? That's so everybody will enforce the rules.
Right. It is interesting that you have a nation that's going to be greatly punished. And again, this goes back, it goes all the way back to their predecessors. Numbers 13 and 14. What happened in Numbers 13 and 14 that caused them not to enter the promised land? Was it not the same thing? A lack of faith, a lack of trust, a lack of obedience, a lack of being willing to do what God said do. Maybe, I don't know, if they didn't believe that God would do what he said he'll do, and hey, we'll just take this and nobody will ever know. I don't know, but that's what it sounds like.
It's another show me example of what he said when he says something. That's for everybody to do it. And the sort of, how that strength is one, like Ryan said, one part of that could destroy the whole city. One part of that could destroy the whole nation.
Yeah, and it did. It was a setback to the whole nation, because what happens next is that they go from Jericho to Ai. That's verse 2. And the men went up and spied out Ai. Verse 3, they returned to Joshua and said, do not have all the people go up, but let's just send 2,000 or 3,000 men and we can attack Ai. Do not make the whole people toil up there, for they are few. Verse 4, so about 3,000 men went up there from the people, and they fled before the men of Ai. And the men of Ai killed about 36 of the men and chased them before the gate as far as Shebarim, and struck them at the descent, and the hearts of the people melted and became as water. That's through verse 5. So at the end of chapter 6, what is the state of the nation? Joshua is exalted. That's the word I was looking for a while ago. The Lord exalts Joshua, okay? Joshua is exalted. Everybody hears about Joshua. There is success. The walls of Jericho fell. They succeeded in taking the city of Jericho, in destroying and in killing and doing what had to be done, taking the city. And that's the way chapter 6 ends. And chapter 7 opens with Israelites broke faith. Israelites had no faith. And as a result of that, the city of Ai is able to defeat them, a very small army of Ai. Would they be Aiites? uh, a small number of the inhabitants of the city of Ai. My time is up. I hear the people. We'll start there next week, chapter 7.